The needle was loaded with enough pentobarbital to stop a heart in 30 seconds. Dr. Marcus Coleman's hands trembled as he prepared the final injection, sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning humming overhead. Rex had exactly 12 hours and 47 minutes left to live. The execution order wasn't a suggestion. It was a death warrant signed in triplicate. Sarah Thompson dropped her clipboard, the metal clattering against concrete as she stared at the kennel. The German shepherd sat motionless, amber eyes fixed on something beyond the chain-link fence, beyond the fluorescent lights, beyond hope itself. His food bowl remained untouched for the third consecutive day. She remembered her own service dog from Afghanistan, how loyal eyes could hold entire universes of trust. Now those same eyes stared back at her from death row. "Execute immediately," the order read in bold red letters. "No appeals. No delays." What had this war hero done to deserve such finality? And why did something deep in Sarah's gut scream that they were about to murder an innocent soul? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The August heat in Phoenix was already climbing toward triple digits at 7 in the morning, but inside the sterile corridors of Maricopa County Animal Control, the air conditioning fought a losing battle against the desert's relentless assault. The smell of disinfectant couldn't quite mask the underlying odors of fear, desperation, and resignation that permeated every corner of the facility. Thomas "Tom" Reynolds sat on the edge of his narrow bed in trailer number 47 at Desert Winds Mobile Home Park, his weathered hands gripping the radio as the morning news crackled through static. At 67, his body bore the accumulated weight of 2 wars and a lifetime of service that had asked for everything and given back precious little. The IED explosion in Kandahar 6 years ago had stolen his sight, but left him with something far more painful: crystal clear memories of everything he'd lost. Local news this morning focuses on a controversial case at the county animal shelter. The reporter's voice carried the practiced neutrality of someone paid to deliver tragedy as entertainment. Rex, a 7-year-old German Shepherd and Afghanistan war veteran, is scheduled for euthanization today following 3 separate bite incidents. Animal control officials say the dog poses an unacceptable risk to public safety. Tom's coffee mug slipped from his fingers, shattering against the linoleum floor in a spray of ceramic and lukewarm liquid. Afghanistan, German Shepherd, war veteran. The words echoed in his mind like artillery fire, each syllable triggering something deep and long buried in his consciousness. His hands began to shake, not the tremor of old age, but the violent trembling of recognition fighting against 6 years of carefully constructed forgetfulness. 200 miles away in the Phoenix facility, Rex lay motionless on the concrete floor of Kennel 17, his magnificent frame reduced to skin, muscle, and an unbreakable spirit that refused to surrender even as his body began to fail. His thick coat, once the proud black and tan of his breed, had dulled to the color of desert sand mixed with ash. The 3 incidents that had sealed his fate were nothing more than the desperate reactions of a broken soldier protecting himself from threats only he could see. Dr. Marcus Coleman stood in his office, staring at the execution order he'd signed, with hands steadier than his conscience deserved. At 54, he'd built a reputation as one of Arizona's most respected veterinarians. But the weight of his secret dealings with insurance companies grew heavier each day. The $50,000 they paid for each high-risk elimination was blood money, and he knew it. But his daughter Emma's cancer treatments had already consumed their savings, their retirement, and his ability to sleep peacefully at night. The American flag hanging limply outside Tom's trailer offered no comfort as he struggled to his feet, guided by muscle memory and the desperate need to understand why a dog's death sentence felt like his own heart being torn from his chest. The radio continued its relentless broadcast as Tom sat surrounded by the wreckage of his morning routine, coffee seeping into the cracks between linoleum tiles like dark blood. His neighbor, Mrs. Patricia Rodriguez, knocked softly on the aluminum door, her voice carrying the gentle concern of someone who'd watched a good man disappear into grief one day at a time. "Tom? I heard the crash. You okay in there, honey?" Patricia had lived in the trailer park longer than anyone could remember, serving as unofficial grandmother to every broken soul who washed up on these 30 acres of forgotten America. At 72, she possessed the rare combination of infinite patience and stubborn determination that made her impossible to ignore. Tom's voice cracked when he finally responded. "Patricia, I need to get to the animal shelter. Today? Right now." He couldn't explain the urgency clawing at his chest, couldn't put words to the certainty that somewhere in that facility waited a piece of his soul he hadn't even known was missing. "The one on the radio? Tom, that dog bit 3 people. They say he's dangerous." But even as she spoke the words, Patricia was already reaching for her car keys. She'd seen that look before. The desperate focus of a man who'd found something worth fighting for in a world that had taken everything else. The drive through Phoenix's sprawling suburbs felt like traveling through purgatory, every red light and traffic delay adding weight to the invisible clock ticking toward 2 o'clock. Tom sat rigid in the passenger seat, his military training warring with an emotional storm he couldn't understand or control. The radio droned with updates about the controversial execution, protesters gathering outside the facility, and legal challenges being filed by animal rights groups. At the Maricopa County Animal Control Facility, chaos reigned in carefully controlled measures. Sarah Thompson stood in the break room staring at her reflection in the window as news vans positioned themselves like vultures in the parking lot. At 34, she'd seen enough death in Afghanistan to recognize the weight settling over the building like a funeral shroud. Her hand unconsciously moved to her stomach, where 8 weeks of new life grew in secret, adding another layer of complexity to decisions that already felt impossible. The pregnancy test sat hidden in her locker, 2 pink lines that had appeared like a miracle and felt like a burden. Her ex-husband's last gift before their marriage finally collapsed under the weight of his infidelity and her inability to forgive. Now she carried this secret through hallways that reeked of disinfectant and impending death, knowing that every decision she made would echo into a future she couldn't yet imagine. Rex's kennel had become a pilgrimage site for staff members who found excuses to walk past and bear witness to dignity in the face of execution. The great dog hadn't moved from his position against the back wall, but his ears tracked every sound, every footstep, every whispered conversation about his fate. His amber eyes held the ancient wisdom of a creature who'd seen too much and understood that humans were capable of both infinite cruelty and inexplicable kindness. Dr. Coleman paced his office like a caged predator, phone pressed to his ear as he listened to another update from his wife about Emma's latest blood work. The numbers weren't good. The experimental treatment in Houston might buy them time, but time cost money they didn't have. The insurance companies had made their offer clear, $50,000 for Rex's elimination, presented as a risk mitigation fee for removing dangerous animals from the population. It was sanitized language for a transaction that made him complicit in murder. Outside the facility, the morning heat had drawn protesters from across the political spectrum. Veterans held signs reading, "Honor our service animals," while parents clutched photographs of children scarred by dog attacks. The crowd was a powder keg of righteous anger and conflicting loyalties, each group convinced of their moral superiority while standing on opposite sides of an impossible divide. When Tom and Patricia finally arrived, the scene looked like a carnival designed by someone with a twisted sense of humor. News crews interviewed anyone willing to speak into a microphone while security guards tried to maintain order among protesters who treated Rex's execution like a referendum on American values. Tom felt the familiar weight of chaos pressing against his chest, the same sensation he'd experienced in Kandahar moments before the world exploded around him. The heat rising from the asphalt created visible waves that distorted everything beyond 30 feet, turning the crowd into a shimmering mirage of human emotion. Tom's white cane tapped against concrete as Patricia guided him through the maze of bodies and opinions, each step bringing him closer to something he couldn't name but desperately needed to find. "I just want to see him," Tom said as they approached the main entrance, his words barely audible over the din of competing voices. "Whatever he's done, whatever he is, I just need to see him once." The automatic doors of the Maricopa County Animal Control Facility opened with a mechanical wheeze that seemed to exhale the building's accumulated sorrow. Tom stepped into the controlled chaos of the lobby, his cane tapping against linoleum that had been mopped so many times it held the permanent scent of industrial cleanser mixed with something deeper, the smell of institutions where hope came to die. Sarah Thompson looked up from the intake desk, where she'd been pretending to review paperwork while actually counting down the minutes until Rex's execution. The blind man entering with the elderly Hispanic woman didn't fit the usual profile of protesters or curiosity seekers. Something about his bearing, the way he held himself despite the obvious weight of grief and age, triggered a recognition that went beyond sight. "I'm here about the dog," Tom said simply, his voice carrying the flat authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "The German Shepherd they're planning to kill today?" Dr. Coleman emerged from his office at precisely the wrong moment, stress radiating from him like heat waves rising from summer asphalt. His daughter's latest test results had arrived an hour ago, and the numbers painted a picture that required immediate action. The $50,000 from the insurance company wasn't just money anymore. It was Emma's chance at seeing her 13th birthday. "I'm sorry, sir, but Rex isn't available for public viewing," Coleman said, his professional demeanor masking the desperation clawing at his chest. "Given his aggressive history, we can't allow civilian contact." Tom's hand tightened on his cane, and for a moment the careful control he'd maintained for 6 years wavered. That dog served in Afghanistan. Whatever he's done, he deserves better than dying alone in a cage. The words hung in the air like a challenge, drawing the attention of everyone within earshot. Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition that went beyond professional courtesy. The dates on Rex's military records had haunted her since she'd first reviewed his file. Afghanistan, 2018 to 2020. The same years she'd served, the same region where she'd lost too many friends to IEDs and sniper fire. "You served?" Sarah asked, moving around the desk to get a closer look at the man whose presence seemed to change the energy in the room. "Marine Corps, 2 tours Vietnam, 1 in Iraq." Tom's voice carried no pride, just the flat recitation of facts that had shaped a lifetime. "Lost my sight in Kandahar, 2018. Same year that dog was deployed." The coincidence hit Sarah like a physical blow. Same year, same region, same war that had taken pieces of all their souls and scattered them across the desert like shrapnel. She looked toward the hallway leading to the kennels, then back at Tom's weathered face, seeing something in his expression that she recognized from her own mirror, the hollow look of someone carrying invisible wounds. Dr. Coleman felt the situation slipping beyond his control like sand through fingers. Every minute of delay was another minute closer to Emma's appointment with her oncologist, another moment when the insurance money remained out of reach. But the gathering crowd in the lobby, the way staff members had begun to gravitate toward the conversation, suggested that this blind Marine wasn't going to accept a simple dismissal. 5 minutes, Sarah said, the words escaping before her rational mind could stop them. 5 minutes to say goodbye. Coleman's jaw tightened. Officer Thompson, that's not protocol. The animal is scheduled for euthanization in 3 hours. We can't. 5 minutes, Sarah repeated, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd given orders under fire and expected them to be followed. He's a veteran. We owe him that much. The walk down the hallway toward the isolation kennels felt like a funeral procession. Tom's cane tapped against concrete while his free hand trailed along the wall, using touch and sound to navigate a space that seemed designed to strip away dignity from both animals and visitors. The cacophony of barking dogs created a wall of noise that spoke of abandonment and desperation, each voice crying out for attention, for love, for someone to remember they existed. Kennel 17 sat at the end of the row, separated from the general population like a prison within a prison. Rex lay motionless against the back wall, his magnificent frame reduced to angles and shadows that spoke of resignation rather than rest. The food and water bowls remained untouched, testimony to a spirit that had chosen hunger over hope. Tom approached the kennel slowly, his movements careful and deliberate. The cane stopped tapping as he reached the chain-link fence, his fingers finding the cold metal and gripping it like an anchor in a storm he couldn't see but definitely felt. "Easy, soldier," Tom said softly, his voice carrying across the small space between them. "I'm here." Rex's ear twitched, just the slightest movement. But in the sterile silence of the isolation ward, it sounded like thunder. Sarah held her breath as the great dog lifted his head for the first time in 18 hours, amber eyes focusing on the blind man who somehow seemed to see straight into his soul. The recognition was immediate and undeniable. Rex stood slowly, his powerful frame unfolding like a prayer answered after years of silence. He approached the fence with careful steps, each movement deliberate and measured, until his black nose pressed against the chain link mere inches from Tom's weathered hand. "That's it, boy," Tom whispered, his fingers finding the gaps in the fence to touch the warm fur of Rex's muzzle. "I know you. God help me, I know you." Rex's tail moved for the first time in 3 days, just a slight wag that sent ripples through his entire body. The sound of his breathing changed, becoming deeper, more settled, as if something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of the world. Sarah stood frozen in the hallway, her phone secretly recording a moment that would change everything for everyone involved. The moment Tom's weathered fingers made contact with Rex's muzzle through the chain-link fence, something electric passed between them, not supernatural, but the kind of recognition that transcends conscious memory and lives in the cellular structure of shared experience. Rex pressed closer to the fence, his massive frame trembling with an emotion that had no name but felt like coming home after years in exile. Sarah's hands shook as she held her phone, capturing footage that would either save a life or document the final cruel irony of a system that destroyed the very souls it claimed to protect. The video quality was poor, shot hastily through the fluorescent-lit hallway, but the emotional content was crystal clear. A blind veteran and a condemned war dog, separated by metal but connected by something deeper than sight or sound. "Stay," Tom whispered, and Rex immediately lowered his haunches to the concrete floor, his tail creating a slow rhythm against the wall. The single word carried weight that transcended simple obedience. It was a command, a promise, and a prayer, all wrapped into syllables that seemed to echo from some shared past neither of them could fully remember. Dr. Coleman appeared at Sarah's shoulder like a specter of bureaucratic authority, his face flushed with the kind of anger that comes from watching carefully laid plans unravel in real time. The insurance company had called twice in the last hour, asking for confirmation that the risk mitigation would proceed on schedule. Emma's treatment appointments were already booked in Houston, the experimental therapy that might save her life contingent on money that wouldn't exist if Rex lived to see another sunset. "This proves nothing," Coleman said, his voice carrying the flat authority of someone who'd learned to suppress conscience in favor of necessity. "One moment of calm behavior doesn't erase 3 documented attacks. That animal is dangerous, and we have a responsibility to protect the public." But even as he spoke the words, Coleman felt them ring hollow against the scene unfolding before him. Rex's entire demeanor had transformed in Tom's presence, the aggressive tension replaced by something that looked suspiciously like peace. The dog's eyes, which had held nothing but suspicion and fear for months, now reflected a calm intelligence that suggested depths Coleman had never bothered to explore. Tom's hand remained pressed against the fence, his fingers stroking Rex's fur through the gaps in the chain link. The contact seemed to unlock something in both of them, memories that had been buried under layers of trauma and institutional indifference. In his mind, Tom could see flashes of images. A young German Shepherd puppy tumbling through obstacle courses, the pride in a young Marine's voice as he described his new partner, the weight of responsibility that came with sending your son to war. "Michael," Tom whispered, and Rex's ears perked forward with an intensity that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. The name hung in the air like incense, carrying with it the weight of loss and love and sacrifice that defined the relationship between fathers and sons, handlers and their 4-legged partners, soldiers and the wars that shaped them. Sarah's research into Rex's military records had revealed fragments of information, carefully redacted files that told a story in whispers rather than declarations. Handler designation: M. Reynolds. Service dates: 2018-2020. Final deployment: Kandahar Province, Afghanistan. Status: Handler, KIA. Asset returned to service pending reassignment. The clinical language couldn't capture the human cost, the way bureaucracy reduced love and loyalty to abbreviations and file numbers. The hallway had begun to fill with staff members who found excuses to witness the interaction between Tom and Rex. Word had spread through the facility like wildfire, carrying with it the kind of energy that builds around moments of genuine human connection in environments designed to process rather than heal. Veterinary technicians, animal control officers, and administrative staff gathered in small clusters, speaking in hushed tones about the blind Marine and the condemned dog. Dr. Coleman felt the weight of their attention like a physical presence, the way crowds gather around traffic accidents, drawn by the promise of drama, but secretly hoping for redemption. His phone buzzed with another text from his wife. Emma's appointment moved to 3 p.m. They need payment confirmation by 2. The message was a countdown clock, marking time until the moment when his daughter's life might hang in the balance of a decision he'd already made but hadn't yet executed. Patricia Rodriguez had remained in the lobby, but the sound of whispered conversations and the unusual foot traffic toward the kennel area told her that something significant was happening. At 72, she'd developed an intuition about human nature that served as an early warning system for both trouble and miracles. The energy in the building had shifted from resignation to something that felt like hope. And hope was a dangerous thing in places where death was scheduled with the precision of a trained timetable. Rex's behavioral transformation continued to deepen as Tom spoke to him in the kind of voice reserved for prayer and confession. The dog's breathing had synchronized with Tom's, creating a rhythm that suggested communication beyond words. His tail moved in slow, measured beats, and his eyes never left Tom's face, as if memorizing features he recognized but couldn't quite place in the context of this sterile environment. "I trained you," Tom said suddenly, the words emerging with the force of revelation rather than memory. "Before Michael deployed, I taught you to sit, to stay, to protect him when I couldn't." The admission felt like pulling a splinter from a wound that had never properly healed, painful but necessary for the healing that might follow. Sarah's phone captured every word, every gesture, every moment of recognition that passed between the man and the dog. The footage was shaky, shot through bars and fluorescent lighting, but it contained something that no amount of professional videography could manufacture: the raw authenticity of truth revealing itself despite institutional attempts to bury it. The clock on the wall read 11:30, marking the steady passage of time toward Rex's scheduled execution at 2 p.m. What had begun as a routine euthanization of a dangerous animal had evolved into something far more complex, a confluence of personal histories and systemic failures that demanded resolution beyond the simple application of lethal injection. Tom's memories were returning in fragments, pieces of a puzzle he'd spent 6 years trying not to assemble. The puppy who'd slept in Michael's room during leave visits home. The pride in his son's voice when he described Rex's performance in training exercises. The last video call before the IED explosion, when Michael had promised that Rex would bring him home safely. But Rex had come home alone, processed through a system that viewed animals as equipment rather than family members. Somewhere in the bureaucratic shuffle, the connection between Tom and Rex had been severed, two wounded warriors separated by paperwork and institutional indifference. Tom had lost his sight and his son. Rex had lost his handler and his purpose. Both had been left to navigate trauma without the support system that might have made healing possible. Dr. Coleman watched the interaction with growing unease, recognizing that his carefully constructed justifications were crumbling in the face of evidence he couldn't refute. The insurance money that had seemed like salvation an hour ago now felt like blood money, payment for destroying something sacred in pursuit of something necessary. The moral calculus that had allowed him to sign Rex's execution order was proving more complex than the simple equation of public safety minus dangerous animal equals community protection. Sarah felt her phone grow warm in her hands as the video file expanded with each passing minute. The footage would need to be shared. She knew that with the same certainty that told her the execution couldn't proceed as scheduled. But sharing the video would mean admitting her role in documenting evidence that contradicted official policy, potentially ending her career in animal control, and eliminating her ability to protect other animals in similar situations. The stakes were rising with each passing moment, personal and professional consequences multiplying like ripples in a pond disturbed by a stone thrown with more force than intended. Tom's presence had disrupted the carefully maintained equilibrium that allowed institutions to function without examining their individual components too closely. Rex was no longer just case number 2024-1847, dangerous animal pending disposal. He was a war veteran with a service record, a loyal companion separated from his family, a living embodiment of the system's failure to care for those who'd sacrificed in service to others. The hallway continued to fill with witnesses, each person drawn by curiosity but remaining because of something deeper, the recognition that they were observing a moment that demanded witness, documentation, and possibly intervention. The video spread through social media with the velocity of wildfire through drought-stricken grassland. Sarah had uploaded the footage to her personal Facebook account at 11:45 a.m. with a simple caption, "This is what love looks like." Within minutes, shares multiplied exponentially as the image of a blind Marine connecting with a condemned war dog struck emotional chords across every demographic line that typically divided American social media. #SaveRex began trending on Twitter before noon, followed rapidly by #BlindMarine and #WarHeroes. The hashtags crossed political boundaries with unusual speed, uniting conservative veterans groups with liberal animal rights activists in a coalition that seemed impossible until the moment it became inevitable. Local Phoenix news stations interrupted regular programming to cover the developing story, and national cable networks began dispatching crews toward Maricopa County with the urgency typically reserved for natural disasters. Inside the animal control facility, Tom remained kneeling beside Rex's kennel, his arthritic joints protesting the concrete floor, but his resolve strengthening with each passing moment. Rex had moved as close to the fence as physics allowed, pressing his substantial frame against the chain-link barrier, as if trying to merge with the man who'd somehow restored meaning to his existence. The dog's transformation from listless resignation to alert engagement had occurred with such dramatic suddenness that staff members found themselves questioning everything they thought they knew about animal behavior and institutional assessment. Dr. Coleman's phone rang with increasing frequency as word of the situation reached administrative levels far above his authority. The mayor's office wanted updates. The city attorney's office wanted legal assessments. The county commissioners wanted assurance that public safety wouldn't be compromised by emotional manipulation disguised as animal advocacy. Each call added another layer of pressure to a situation that had already exceeded his ability to control through standard bureaucratic procedures. "Dr. Coleman, this is City Attorney Rebecca Martinez." The voice on his phone carried the crisp authority of someone accustomed to managing crisis situations. "I'm seeing social media reports about the Rex situation. We need immediate clarification on the legal exposure if we proceed with the scheduled euthanization against this level of public opposition." Coleman closed his office door and lowered his voice to prevent eavesdropping by staff members whose loyalty might be wavering in real time. "The execution order is legally sound. 3 documented bite incidents, formal assessment of public safety risk, all procedures followed according to municipal code." "That's not what I'm asking," Martinez replied sharply. "I'm asking about the political and legal exposure if we kill a war veteran's dog on live television while half the internet is calling us monsters. This isn't about municipal code anymore. This is about survival." The truth hit Coleman like a physical blow. This had never been about Rex's behavior or public safety. This was about money, politics, and the complex web of interests that determined which lives had value and which could be sacrificed for the greater good. The insurance companies that had offered him $50,000 for Rex's elimination weren't motivated by public safety. They were calculating actuarial tables and risk mitigation strategies that treated living beings as line items in profit and loss statements. Outside the facility, the crowd had swollen beyond the capacity of normal protest management. Veterans in wheelchairs held signs reading, "Honor our service animals," while Gold Star mothers clutched photographs of sons and daughters who'd died with their military working dogs beside them. Animal rights activists who normally focused on farm conditions and puppy mills found themselves standing shoulder to shoulder with conservative military families who rarely agreed on anything except the sanctity of the bond between soldiers and their four-legged partners. Patricia Rodriguez watched the growing demonstration from her position near the main entrance, her weathered hands gripping the strap of her purse as she recognized the signs of a situation that had moved beyond anyone's ability to control. At 72, she'd lived through enough social upheavals to understand that certain moments became turning points, not because anyone planned them, but because they crystallized emotions that had been building pressure for years without release. The local news crews had been joined by national networks whose helicopters circled overhead like mechanical vultures documenting the convergence of grief, anger, and hope that had transformed a routine animal control procedure into a referendum on American values. CNN, Fox News, and MSNBC rarely agreed on anything, but the image of a blind Marine kneeling beside a condemned war dog transcended partisan boundaries and appealed to emotional territories that existed beyond political affiliation. Inside the kennel, Rex's behavior continued to evolve in ways that challenged every assumption in his behavioral assessment file. The aggressive posturing that had characterized his interactions with staff members had been replaced by a calm attentiveness that suggested intelligence rather than instinct. His eyes tracked Tom's movements with the focus of a soldier receiving orders from a trusted commander, and his body language spoke of readiness rather than hostility. "Tell me about Michael," Tom said softly, his voice carrying the weight of a father's love mixed with a warrior's understanding of sacrifice. Rex's ears perked forward at the name, and he released a sound that was part whine, part sigh, the vocalization of grief that transcends species boundaries and speaks to the universal experience of loss. Sarah found herself crying as she watched the interaction between Tom and Rex, tears that carried the accumulated weight of her own service in Afghanistan, and the recognition that she was witnessing something that restored faith in the possibility of healing. The pregnancy hormones might have amplified her emotional response, but the core truth remained unchanged. This was what love looked like when it refused to accept institutional barriers or bureaucratic limitations. The phone in Dr. Coleman's office rang again, displaying a number he'd been dreading since uploading Rex's case file to the insurance company's database 3 months earlier. The voice on the other end belonged to someone who'd never introduced himself by name, but whose authority was unquestioned. "Dr. Coleman, we've been monitoring the social media situation regarding case number 2024-11847. Proceeding with the elimination now would create unacceptable exposure for our organization. Consider the contract suspended pending resolution of media attention." The line went dead, leaving Coleman staring at his phone with the realization that Rex's execution had been canceled not by mercy or legal intervention, but by corporate risk assessment. The $50,000 he'd counted on for Emma's treatment had evaporated like morning dew in Arizona heat, leaving him to confront the possibility that his daughter's life might depend on choices he was no longer willing to make. Tom's hands had found their way through the fence to rest on Rex's massive head, fingers stroking fur that carried the scent of institutional disinfectant mixed with something deeper, the indefinable smell of a warrior who'd seen too much but retained the capacity for trust. The contact seemed to unlock memories in both of them, fragments of shared experience that existed beyond conscious recollection, but lived in the muscle memory of loyalty and service. "I failed him," Tom whispered, his voice breaking with the weight of 6 years' accumulated guilt. "I sent my boy to war with you to protect him, and I failed him." "I failed both of you." Rex responded by pressing harder against the fence, his powerful frame trembling with emotion that had no outlet except the inadequate expression of physical proximity. The dog's breathing had synchronized with Tom's, creating a rhythm that spoke of connection deeper than training or instinct, the bond between souls who'd shared purpose and loss in equal measure. The clock on the wall read 1:15 p.m., 45 minutes before Rex's scheduled execution. But the social media storm had created pressures that existed outside normal administrative timelines, forcing decisions that would normally take weeks of committee review into the compressed urgency of real-time crisis management. The situation had moved beyond Dr. Coleman's authority to resolve, escalating through layers of bureaucracy toward decision-makers who understood political consequences better than they understood the emotional needs of wounded warriors. Sarah's phone buzzed with notifications from Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram as the video continued to spread across social networks with geometric progression. Friends from her military service were sharing the footage with comments about their own relationships with working dogs. Strangers were tagging elected officials, demanding intervention in a situation that had become larger than Rex or Tom or even the principle of justice for military animals. The crowd outside had grown large enough to require police traffic control, and the Phoenix mayor's office had dispatched a senior aide to assess the situation firsthand. This was no longer a local animal control issue. It had become a national story about the way America treated its veterans, both human and canine, after their service was no longer needed. The emergency court hearing convened at 1:30 p.m. in the sweltering courthouse of downtown Phoenix, where Judge Margaret Hawthorne presided over a case that had exploded beyond the boundaries of municipal animal control into the realm of national symbolism. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with spectators spilling into the hallways as reporters live-streamed proceedings that would determine whether Rex lived or died based on legal precedent rather than social media sentiment. Tom sat in the front row, his white cane resting against his knee as court-appointed attorneys argued over the fate of a dog he'd known for less than 4 hours, but felt connected to through bonds that transcended conscious memory. Rex remained in his kennel at the animal control facility. His execution temporarily stayed pending the court's decision, but the clock continued its relentless advance toward what felt like inevitable tragedy. Doctor. Coleman took the witness stand with the weight of professional expertise and personal desperation pressing down on his shoulders like Arizona heat. His testimony was clinical, measured, designed to convince the court that public safety required Rex's elimination regardless of social media outcry or emotional manipulation. But as he spoke, his voice carried the hollow ring of someone reciting words he no longer believed. The defendant animal has demonstrated aggressive behavior on 3 separate occasions, Coleman testified, his hands gripping the witness stand rail with enough force to whiten his knuckles. Each incident involved unprovoked attacks on facility staff members, resulting in injuries that required medical attention. The risk assessment is clear. This animal poses an unacceptable danger to public safety. Tom's court-appointed attorney, a young public defender named James Martinez, who'd volunteered for the case after seeing the video on Facebook, rose to cross-examine Coleman with the passion of someone who'd found meaning in defending the defenseless. His questions cut through the clinical language to expose the human cost of institutional procedures that reduced living beings to case numbers and risk assessments. Dr. Coleman, isn't it true that all 3 incidents occurred when Rex was cornered or approached aggressively by staff members who were unfamiliar with military working dog protocols? Martinez's voice carried the authority of someone who'd done his homework, despite having less than 2 hours to prepare for the most important case of his career. Coleman's answer came slowly, each word weighted with implications that extended far beyond the immediate question. Military working dogs require specialized handling. Our staff follows standard animal control procedures, which may not account for animals with combat trauma. The admission hung in the courtroom like incense, carrying with it the recognition that Rex's aggressive behavior might be symptoms of PTSD rather than inherent dangerousness. Judge Hawthorne leaned forward, her expression suggesting that the legal arguments were less compelling than the human drama unfolding in her courtroom. Dr. Coleman, what is your professional assessment of the interaction between Mr. Reynolds and the defendant animal that was captured on video this morning? Her question was precise, designed to force Coleman to choose between his professional reputation and his emerging conscience. Coleman's pause stretched long enough for everyone in the courtroom to understand that this moment would define not just Rex's fate, but Coleman's ability to live with the consequences of his testimony. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man choosing honesty over convenience for the first time in months. The animal's behavior with Mr. Reynolds was unprecedented. I've never observed such a dramatic behavioral change in response to human contact. It suggests a level of recognition and trust that contradicts our risk assessment. The courtroom erupted in whispered conversations as Coleman's admission undermined the foundation of the prosecution's case. Judge Hawthorne called for order, but the energy in the room had shifted towards something that felt like hope, tinged with the recognition that hope could be dangerous in situations where law and bureaucracy held more weight than justice. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had grown large enough to require coordination between Phoenix Police and Maricopa County Sheriff's deputies. Veterans organizations had organized a formal honor guard, while animal rights activists maintained a vigil that had taken on the solemnity of a funeral that might be prevented through collective will and public pressure. Sarah remained at the animal control facility, officially guarding Rex but actually serving as witness to his continued transformation. The dog had begun eating again for the first time in 3 days, approaching his food bowl with the methodical precision of a soldier following routine rather than the desperate hunger of an animal facing death. His eyes remained alert, tracking every sound and movement as if waiting for orders that would restore meaning to his existence. The clock on the courthouse wall read 2:15 p.m., 15 minutes past Rex's original execution time. But the legal proceedings had created a temporary stay that existed in the liminal space between life and death, where outcomes depended on human judgment rather than institutional procedure. The fate of one German Shepherd had become a test of America's commitment to caring for those who'd served in war zones where loyalty and sacrifice were daily requirements rather than abstract concepts. Judge Hawthorne prepared to render a decision that would resonate far beyond her courtroom, understanding that some cases transcend legal precedent and require judges to choose between law and justice when the two diverge in ways that challenge the foundations of institutional authority. Judge Hawthorne's gavel fell at 2:47 p.m. with the finality of a gunshot, her decision echoing through the packed courtroom like thunder rolling across the desert. The stay of execution is hereby lifted. The original order stands. Rex will be euthanized within 24 hours, unless alternative placement can be secured through proper legal channels. Her words carried the weight of legal precedent, but her expression suggested a judge who understood that justice and law sometimes diverged in ways that left everyone wounded. The courtroom erupted into chaos as supporters screamed protests, while opponents nodded with grim satisfaction. Tom sat motionless in the front row, his blind eyes fixed on something beyond sight as the reality of institutional power crashed over him like a wave designed to drown hope in bureaucratic procedure. The young attorney beside him was already filing appeal paperwork, but everyone understood that 24 hours wasn't enough time to navigate the legal system's deliberately slow machinery. Dr. Coleman left the courthouse through a side exit, avoiding the crowds and cameras that had transformed Rex's case into a national referendum on American values. His testimony had been legally accurate but morally hollow, providing the court with scientific justification for a decision that felt like murder dressed in the language of public safety. The $50,000 from the insurance company was gone, canceled when the case became too visible for corporate comfort, leaving him to face Emma's medical bills with depleted savings and a conscience that would never fully heal. Sarah received the news via text message while standing guard outside Rex's kennel, watching the great dog pace with the restless energy of someone who sensed change but couldn't understand its implications. The execution was rescheduled for 3 p.m. the following day, giving opponents exactly 24 hours to find a legal miracle or alternative placement that could satisfy the court's requirements for public safety. The drive back to the animal control facility felt like a funeral procession, with Tom and Patricia following behind news vans and protesters who'd transformed a routine euthanization into a national cause célèbre. The Phoenix heat had reached 118 degrees, turning the afternoon into a furnace that matched the emotional temperature of a situation that had moved beyond anyone's ability to control through normal channels. Rex seemed to sense Tom's return before the sound of footsteps reached the kennel area. The dog's ears perked forward, and his tail began its slow rhythm against the concrete wall as familiar voices carried down the hallway, like prayers answered through institutional indifference. The reunion was wordless but profound, two wounded warriors finding solace in proximity that transcended the physical barriers designed to separate dangerous animals from vulnerable humans. "I'm not leaving you again," Tom whispered, his weathered hands finding Rex's fur through the chain-link fence. "Whatever happens, whatever they decide, I'm not leaving you to die alone." The promise carried weight that extended beyond immediate comfort into the realm of sacred oaths between soldiers who understood that loyalty trumped convenience, regulation, and even survival when circumstances demanded choices between honor and safety. Rex pressed against the fence with enough force to make the metal rattle, his massive frame trembling with emotion that had no adequate expression except physical proximity to the man who'd restored meaning to his existence. Sarah's phone rang with increasing frequency as media outlets sought official statements about Rex's reprieve and the legal challenges that would determine his fate within the compressed timeline of a single news cycle. Animal rights attorneys had offered pro bono representation, while veterans organizations pledged financial support for any legal fees associated with securing Rex's freedom. But the legal system moved with deliberate slowness that made 24 hours feel like 24 minutes when measured against institutional requirements. Dr. Coleman returned to his office to find his wife Rebecca waiting with Emma's latest medical report spread across his desk, like evidence in a trial where love and money competed for the right to determine a 13-year-old girl's future. The experimental treatment in Houston remained available, but the cost had increased by $30,000 due to enhanced protocols that sounded like medical language for price gouging disguised as innovation. "The insurance company called," Rebecca said, her voice carrying the flat exhaustion of someone who'd spent months navigating medical bureaucracy while watching her daughter grow thinner and more fragile with each passing day. "They're denying coverage for the Houston treatment. They say it's experimental and not medically necessary." The words hit Coleman like physical blows, each syllable carrying the weight of decisions that had seemed rational when Emma's life wasn't hanging in the balance. The $50,000 he'd counted on from Rex's elimination had evaporated when the case became too visible for corporate comfort, leaving him to choose between his daughter's life and his professional ethics in ways that made sleep impossible and conscience unbearable. Outside the facility, the crowd had organized itself into shifts that would maintain a vigil through the night and into the following day when Rex's execution was scheduled to proceed. Veterans in wheelchairs shared stories about their own service animals, while Gold Star mothers held photographs of sons and daughters who'd died with military working dogs beside them. The demonstration had evolved beyond protest into something that resembled a wake for values that seemed to be dying alongside the institutional machinery designed to process rather than heal. Tom spent the evening sitting beside Rex's kennel, sharing stories about Michael that seemed to unlock memories in both of them. The dog's responses to his son's name had become more pronounced, tail movements and ear positions that suggested recognition deeper than training or instinct. As darkness fell across the desert, fluorescent lights created harsh shadows that transformed the animal control facility into something that resembled a prison where hope was processed into resignation through procedures designed to prevent emotional attachment. "He used to dream about you," Tom said softly, his voice carrying across the small space between them like a bridge built from memory and grief. "After his first deployment, when you were just a puppy learning to be a soldier, he'd tell me about the obstacle courses, the way you'd follow him everywhere like you'd been waiting your whole life to find him." Rex's breathing had synchronized with Tom's, creating a rhythm that suggested communication beyond words. His amber eyes never left Tom's face, as if memorizing features that belonged to someone he'd been searching for without understanding what he was looking for, until the moment recognition restored meaning to his existence. Sarah remained at the facility well past her shift, officially processing paperwork, but actually serving as witness to the bond developing between Tom and Rex in the compressed time remaining before institutional procedure would separate them permanently. Her pregnancy had begun to manifest in subtle ways: heightened emotional responses, fatigue that felt like carrying additional weight, and an awareness of life's fragility that made Rex's scheduled execution feel like participating in murder disguised as public service. The night stretched toward dawn with the relentless progression of time that makes 24 hours feel simultaneously infinite and impossibly brief when measured against the stakes involved. Tom dozed fitfully in a chair beside Rex's kennel while the dog maintained alert vigilance, as if standing guard over the man who'd restored his faith in human reliability after months of institutional abandonment. At 6 a.m., 18 hours before Rex's scheduled execution, Sarah's phone rang with news that would change everything for everyone involved. The caller's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected lives across multiple states and time zones. "Officer Thompson, this is Colonel Patricia Hayes, commanding officer of the Canine Affairs Division at Fort Carson. I've been monitoring the situation regarding Rex, and I believe there may have been a significant error in his processing when he returned from deployment. We need to talk immediately." Colonel Patricia Hayes arrived at the Maricopa County Animal Control Facility at 7:30 a.m. in a government sedan that carried the weight of federal authority and the promise of revelations that would shatter carefully constructed lies. At 54, she possessed the bearing of someone who'd spent 3 decades navigating military bureaucracy while maintaining the moral clarity necessary to distinguish between orders and conscience when the two conflicted in ways that demanded choice. Sarah met her at the main entrance, clutching a manila folder that contained Rex's incomplete military records and the growing certainty that institutional procedure had failed in ways that went beyond simple negligence into the realm of systematic cover-up. The colonel's presence transformed the facility's atmosphere from resignation to anticipation, as if federal intervention might provide solutions that local authority had proven incapable of delivering. "Officer Thompson, I need to see the animal immediately," Colonel Hayes said, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "And I need to speak with Mr. Reynolds. There are details about Rex's service record that were classified until yesterday, when my superiors decided that national media attention required full disclosure rather than continued concealment." The walk to Rex's kennel felt like a procession toward truth that had been buried under layers of bureaucratic procedure and institutional convenience. Tom remained beside the fence where he'd spent the night, his weathered hand resting against Rex's muzzle through the chain-link barrier that separated them by inches but connected them through bonds that transcended physical obstacles. Colonel Hayes stopped abruptly when she saw Rex, her professional composure wavering as recognition hit her like a physical blow. The dog she remembered from classified briefings and commendation ceremonies was thinner, scarred by months of institutional neglect, but unmistakably the same animal who'd saved 12 lives during 47 combat missions in Afghanistan. His service record read like a catalog of heroism that had been reduced to case number 2024-1847, dangerous animal pending disposal. "Jesus Christ," she whispered, forgetting military bearing in the face of evidence that the system she'd served for 30 years had failed one of its most decorated veterans. "This is Ranger, call sign Romeo 7. He's supposed to be at Fort Carson receiving veteran care, not sitting in a kill shelter because someone lost his paperwork." The revelation hit Sarah like an explosion, fragments of truth reassembling themselves into a picture that explained Rex's behavioral issues, his response to Tom's presence, and the institutional indifference that had brought them to within hours of executing a war hero. Rex wasn't just any German shepherd with PTSD. He was a decorated military working dog whose service record included more commendations than most human soldiers earned in entire careers. Tom's blind eyes turned toward Colonel Hayes with the precision of someone who'd learned to navigate by sound and instinct rather than sight. Romeo 7. That was Michael's call sign for his partner. His voice carried the weight of recognition that went beyond conscious memory into the realm of parental intuition that had sensed connection without understanding its source. "Mr. Reynolds, your son Michael was Romeo 7's handler during his final deployment," Colonel Hayes said, her voice softening with the respect due to a Gold Star father who'd lost his son in service to his country. The dog was supposed to be returned to family members after Michael's death, but there was a clerical error that sent him into the general population of returned military animals. "We've been searching for him for 2 years." The truth hit Tom with enough force to buckle his knees, sending him reaching for the fence to maintain balance as the weight of recognition crashed over him like artillery fire. Rex had been Michael's partner, his four-legged battle buddy, the companion who'd stayed with his son's body for 8 hours in hostile territory while waiting for evacuation that came too late to save the handler but arrived in time to bring the dog home to a family that never knew he existed. Dr. Coleman emerged from his office at the sound of raised voices, his face carrying the pale exhaustion of someone who'd spent the night calculating the cost of conscience against the price of his daughter's life. The insurance money was gone, canceled when Rex's case became too visible for corporate comfort, but the moral weight of his decisions remained like a tumor that had metastasized through his ability to sleep peacefully or look at his reflection without flinching. "Dr. Coleman, I'm Colonel Hayes, Fort Carson," she said, extending her hand with the courtesy due to civilian authority, while maintaining the bearing that suggested military rank carried weight beyond local jurisdiction. "I need to discuss the circumstances that brought a decorated military working dog to your facility and the procedural failures that nearly resulted in his execution." Coleman's handshake was brief, his eyes avoiding direct contact with someone whose presence represented accountability for decisions he'd made in the gray area between necessity and greed. The classified nature of Rex's service record provided cover for institutional failures, but Colonel Hayes's arrival suggested that cover was about to be stripped away like bandages from wounds that had never properly healed. "There must be some mistake," Coleman said, his voice carrying the hollow ring of someone who knew he was lying but couldn't afford to admit truth that would expose the full scope of his complicity. Rex was processed through standard channels. No military designation, no special handling requirements, just another aggressive animal requiring disposal for public safety. Colonel Hayes opened her briefcase and withdrew a file thick enough to suggest that Rex's military service had generated substantial documentation despite attempts to classify or conceal his record. The photographs showed a younger, healthier version of the dog, now sitting in Kennel 17, posing with soldiers whose faces had been redacted but whose body language spoke of genuine affection for their four-legged comrade. "Ranger Rex served with distinction in 47 combat missions," Colonel Hayes said, reading from official records that carried the weight of federal authority. His actions directly resulted in the preservation of 12 American lives and the successful completion of operations that remain classified. He was awarded the Dickin Medal, the animal equivalent of the Medal of Honor, for exceptional bravery under fire. The words hung in the air like incense, transforming Rex from dangerous animal into war hero through the simple application of accurate information. Sarah felt tears building behind her eyes as the full scope of institutional failure became clear, not just the paperwork errors that had landed Rex in a kill shelter, but the systematic indifference that had reduced a decorated veteran to a case number awaiting disposal. Tom's hand found Rex's fur through the fence, his fingers trembling with emotion that went beyond grief into the realm of recognition and redemption. Michael's final letter, written the day before the IED explosion that took his life, had mentioned his partner, but Tom's blindness had prevented him from reading words that might have prepared him for this moment of truth. "He stayed with Michael," Tom said, his voice breaking with the weight of understanding that his son hadn't died alone in the desert, but had been accompanied by loyalty that transcended species boundaries and military protocol. "He stayed with him until help came." Colonel Hayes nodded, her own composure wavering as she recognized the emotional weight of reuniting a war hero with his fallen handler's family. For 8 hours in hostile territory while taking intermittent sniper fire, the evacuation team found them together. Rex had positioned himself between Michael's body and the direction of enemy contact, maintaining protective posture even after his handler was beyond help. The revelation completed the circle of understanding that had been broken by bureaucratic failure and institutional indifference. Rex's aggressive behavior wasn't random violence, but the predictable response of a PTSD-affected veteran who'd been abandoned by the system he'd served with distinction. His recognition of Tom wasn't supernatural connection, but the deeply ingrained loyalty of a military working dog who'd been trained to protect his handler's family as extension of his mission. Doctor. Coleman felt the ground shifting beneath his feet as the full scope of his near-catastrophic error became clear. He'd been prepared to execute a Medal of Honor recipient based on fabricated behavioral assessments and financial incentives that had nothing to do with public safety or professional judgment. The insurance companies had targeted Rex specifically because his military service made him valuable enough to justify elimination payments that exceeded standard rates for civilian animals. "Dr. Coleman, I'll need copies of all documentation related to Rex's care and behavioral assessment," Colonel Hayes said, her voice carrying the authority of federal investigation rather than friendly inquiry. "There will be questions about how a decorated military veteran ended up scheduled for execution based on incidents that appear to have been provoked or fabricated. The administrative investigation would come later, but the immediate crisis had been resolved through the simple application of accurate information and federal authority that superseded local jurisdiction. Rex's execution was permanently canceled, his status upgraded from dangerous animal to retired military veteran entitled to specialized care that honored his service rather than treating him as disposal problem. Sarah's phone buzzed with notifications as news of Rex's military record spread through social media with the same velocity that had made his scheduled execution a national cause célèbre. The hashtags evolved from #SaveRex to #HeroHomecoming, transforming a story about institutional failure into a narrative of redemption that satisfied America's need for happy endings that validated faith in justice, delayed but not denied. The crowd outside the facility erupted in celebration as word spread that Rex would live, his military service record providing the legal justification that emotional appeals had failed to achieve. Veterans wept openly while animal rights activists embraced strangers in expressions of joy that transcended political boundaries and united people around shared recognition that some victories were worth celebrating without reservation. Tom remained beside Rex's kennel as chaos swirled around them, his hand maintaining contact with fur that carried the scent of his son's memory and the promise of healing that came through connection rather than isolation. Rex pressed against the fence with enough force to make the metal sing, his tail creating rhythm against concrete that sounded like applause for a performance that had lasted 2 years longer than anyone expected, but ended with the audience on its feet. "We're going home, boy," Tom whispered, his voice carrying promise that went beyond immediate relief into the realm of commitment that would last whatever time remained to both of them. We're going home, and we're never letting bureaucracy separate us again. Dr. Coleman returned to his office to find his wife Rebecca and daughter Emma waiting with expressions that suggested they'd been watching the news coverage and understood that their husband and father had come within hours of participating in something that would have haunted them forever. Emma's cancer remained a threat that required immediate attention, but the GoFundMe account established by strangers who'd seen their story had already raised enough money to cover the Houston treatment without requiring moral compromises that would have destroyed their family from within. "Daddy, you did the right thing," Emma said, her 13-year-old voice carrying wisdom that cancer had forced upon her earlier than childhood should have to accommodate adult complexity. "The dog gets to live, and we'll find another way. We always find another way." The resolution felt like sunrise after the longest night in institutional memory, but the deeper questions raised by Rex's case would require months of investigation and reform to address properly. How many other military animals had been lost in bureaucratic shuffle? How many veterans, human and canine, had been failed by systems designed to process rather than heal? The answers would come slowly, but Rex's survival had created momentum for change that extended far beyond one dog's reprieve from execution. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the desert, preparations began for Rex's transition from condemned prisoner to honored veteran, receiving the care his service had earned, but bureaucracy had denied. The process would take time: medical evaluation, behavioral assessment by specialists familiar with military working dogs, and legal paperwork to formalize his status as retired veteran rather than dangerous animal. But for the first time in 2 years, Rex had reason to believe that tomorrow would be better than today, that the man whose scent carried echoes of his beloved handler would remain constant rather than disappearing like everyone else who'd promised care but delivered abandonment. The bond between them had been forged in desert heat and sealed by institutional failure, but it would be tested by the daily work of healing that required patience, commitment, and faith that some connections were strong enough to survive whatever challenges bureaucracy and circumstance might devise. 6 months later, the desert heat of Phoenix had given way to the gentler warmth of autumn, and the small house on Elm Street had been transformed from a property listing into something that felt like home for the first time in years. Tom Reynolds sat on the front porch swing that Sarah had insisted they install, his weathered hands resting on Rex's massive head as the German Shepherd dozed in the late afternoon sunshine. The dog's breathing was deep and even, the peaceful rhythm of an animal who'd finally learned that safety could be trusted and love didn't require vigilance. The house itself was modest: 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, and a kitchen large enough for the growing family that had formed around shared trauma and collective healing. Sarah's pregnancy had progressed without complications, her belly now round enough to make Rex curious about the changes in her scent, and Tom protective in ways that surprised him with their intensity. At 67, he'd never expected to become a father figure again. But life had a way of offering second chances to those who'd lost everything and learned to rebuild from the foundation up. Rex had gained 30 pounds since his rescue from the animal control facility, his coat restored to the lustrous black and tan that spoke of proper nutrition and veterinary care. The behavioral issues that had nearly cost him his life had been addressed through specialized therapy designed for military working dogs suffering from PTSD. The treatment hadn't erased his trauma, but it had given him tools to manage stress responses and distinguish between genuine threats and triggers that existed only in memory. The Phoenix Foundation for Veteran Animals had grown from Tom's desire to prevent other military working dogs from experiencing Rex's near execution into a nationally recognized organization that provided specialized care, placement services, and advocacy for animals who'd served their country with distinction but found themselves abandoned by the bureaucratic systems they'd trusted to care for them in retirement. The Foundation's success had attracted attention from Congress, leading to legislation that reformed how military animals were processed after their service ended. Dr. Marcus Coleman had completed his community service at the animal shelter, but his involvement with the Foundation had continued voluntarily as he sought to make amends for decisions that had nearly resulted in the execution of a war hero. His daughter Emma's cancer had gone into remission following the Houston treatment, funded by donations from strangers who'd been moved by their story, and understood that healing sometimes required community effort rather than individual sacrifice. The legal investigation into the insurance companies that had paid for risk elimination of military animals had resulted in federal charges and policy reforms that made such arrangements illegal. The money that had motivated Rex's near execution was revealed to be part of a broader scheme that had resulted in the unnecessary deaths of dozens of veteran animals whose only crime was developing PTSD symptoms that made them expensive to treat rather than profitable to eliminate. Sarah's phone still buzzed regularly with interview requests from media outlets that wanted to follow up on the story that had captured national attention and forced conversations about how America treated its veterans, both human and animal. But she'd learned to balance public advocacy with private healing, understanding that some victories required sustained effort rather than momentary attention spans that moved on to new causes without ensuring lasting change. The wedding had been small, held in the backyard of their new home with Rex serving as ring bearer and Patricia Rodriguez providing the kind of maternal blessing that made chosen family feel as permanent as biological connection. Tom's vows had been spoken through tears that acknowledged both loss and gratitude, recognizing that Michael's death had led to Rex's survival and Sarah's love in ways that suggested purpose even in tragedy. The nursery was ready for their daughter, due in 6 weeks and already named Michael Rose, honoring both the son Tom had lost and the new beginning that Sarah represented. Rex had shown remarkable intuition about the pregnancy, becoming protective of Sarah in ways that suggested he understood the fragility of new life and the importance of standing guard over those who couldn't protect themselves. Tom's disability payments had been supplemented by speaking fees from veterans organizations that wanted to hear about the bond between soldiers and their animals, the failures of institutional care, and the possibility of healing that came through connection rather than isolation. His blindness remained permanent, but his purpose had been restored through the simple act of choosing love over resignation when circumstances made hope seem impossible. The afternoons had become their favorite time, when the Phoenix heat subsided enough to make the porch comfortable, and Rex could doze while Tom and Sarah planned for a future that included college funds, family vacations, and the ordinary challenges of raising a child in a world that could be cruel but was also capable of unexpected kindness. Rex's transformation from condemned prisoner to therapy dog had been remarkable in its scope and speed. He worked with other military animals suffering from PTSD, his calm presence providing comfort to dogs and cats who'd lost their handlers or been traumatized by combat experiences that civilian veterinarians struggled to understand. His success rate was extraordinary, suggesting that healing sometimes required recognition from those who'd shared similar trauma rather than treatment from those who'd studied it academically. The Foundation's headquarters occupied a renovated warehouse on the outskirts of Phoenix with indoor training facilities, medical equipment, and housing for animals awaiting placement with families qualified to provide specialized care. The staff included former military handlers, veterinarians familiar with combat trauma, and volunteers who'd been drawn to the work by Rex's story and stayed because of the daily satisfaction that came from saving lives, one animal at a time. Sarah's role as Foundation Director had evolved naturally from her experience with Rex's case and her understanding of the bureaucratic failures that had nearly resulted in tragedy. Her pregnancy hadn't slowed her commitment to the work, though she delegated more physical tasks to other staff members as her due date approached, and Tom's protective instincts made him nervous about her exposure to potentially aggressive animals. The evening news still occasionally featured updates about military animal welfare, legislative progress, and the Foundation's success in placing veteran animals with appropriate families. But the story had moved beyond media attention into the realm of institutional change that would outlast news cycles and continue protecting animals whose service had earned them better than abandonment or execution based on behavioral symptoms that reflected trauma rather than inherent dangerousness. As the sun set behind the mountains surrounding Phoenix, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded Tom of the desert sunsets he'd watched during his own military service, he felt the kind of peace that comes from understanding that some battles are worth fighting regardless of the odds against victory. Rex stirred beside him, lifting his massive head to nuzzle Tom's hand with the gentle affection of a warrior who'd found his way home. The future stretched ahead of them like a promise that included sleepless nights with a newborn, the challenges of aging with grace, and the ongoing work of ensuring that other military animals received the care their service had earned. It wouldn't be easy, healing never was, but it would be meaningful in ways that justified the struggle and honored the sacrifices that had brought them together. The porch light came on automatically as darkness settled over the neighborhood, illuminating a scene that represented everything America claimed to value: family, service, second chances, and the recognition that love was stronger than the institutional failures that tried to separate those who belonged together. Rex's tail thumped against the wooden deck in slow rhythm, a sound that spoke of contentment and the kind of happiness that didn't require fanfare to feel complete. Sometimes life's greatest blessings come disguised as heartbreak. Tom Reynolds lost his sight, his son, and nearly lost hope, until a condemned war dog named Rex reminded him that love doesn't end with loss. It transforms into something stronger. At 67, Tom discovered that family isn't just blood, but the bonds we choose to honor. When bureaucracy failed and the system abandoned them both, their connection proved that loyalty, sacrifice, and second chances still matter in an America that sometimes forgets its promises to those who served. Rex taught Tom that blindness doesn't mean you can't see what truly matters, and that sometimes the family we need most finds us when we've stopped looking. Their story proves that it's never too late to start over, never too old to love again, and never wrong to believe that miracles happen to those who refuse to give up on what's right. Questions for engagement. What military animal or pet changed your life? Have you ever experienced an unexpected blessing that came through heartbreak? Share your story in the comments. We'd love to hear how loyalty and love have shaped your journey.